Hello and welcome to the Global Dialogue. I'm Shereen Bhan, and it is our pleasure today to welcome on the program the Managing Director for Operations at the World Bank, Anna Bjerde. She oversees a portfolio of over $340 billion across many countries that the World Bank operates in. Anna, what an absolute pleasure to have you join us here in India. Thank you very much for your time.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let me start by talking to you about what we're seeing happen globally, Anna, in the context of the global economic outlook estimate that the World Bank has. 2.7% in 2024, expected to remain steady. That was the estimate for 2025 and 2026. Have the downside risks to that target gone up significantly since the start of the year?
So first and foremost, the main message we have been conveying with our numbers is that the good news is that the global economy seems to be stabilizing. But there are two issues. One, it's stabilizing at too low a growth rate. And if it goes lower, that's obviously even more problematic. And the other message is that we've always seen emerging and developing countries grow faster than developed countries, and we're now seeing a slowdown in the growth of developed and emerging markets, which means it gets much, much more difficult to work on the delivery of raising incomes, reducing poverty, and getting the kind of recovery that the world is still looking for.
You know, speaking of the recovery as well as the negative shocks that the global economy has had to contend with over the last several years, what we are in the midst of today is a fair degree of volatility and uncertainty and an escalation of this potential trade war, with tariffs being imposed by the US, reciprocal tariffs now being imposed by countries like Canada, Mexico and China. What impact do you believe that this is likely to have in the near term, in the medium term and the long term?
Yeah, so we have not analyzed any impact of tariffs on the global economic outlook. What we very much focus on is our mandate, which is medium-term and long-term economic development, with a focus on poverty reduction, with a focus on really creating jobs, which has become a huge issue. We estimate that about 1.2 billion jobs are needed in the world by 2030, and only about 420 million right now are expected to be offered. So we really want to double down on the need for job creation, which needs that growth. And then, of course, also opportunities for young people. So many countries around the world have so many young people, and we want to make sure they have opportunities, which first and foremost comes with being skilled and being able to attain jobs. More generally, we do believe that countries benefit a lot from being integrated with each other. And that means that a vibrant and dynamic economic ecosystem where countries are importing and exporting is a good thing, because it creates new markets. It creates opportunities, of course, to earn revenues, but it also, when a country, for example, imports, it's not only importing goods and services, it's actually importing new technology, new innovation, new skills. So fundamentally, we think that's a good thing.
Well, that is a good thing, but what we are seeing at this point in time is a retreat, not just a retreat from globalization as we know it, but a retreat from multilateral institutions and multilateralism in general. As the World Bank, how do you view this retreat specifically of large economies like the US? So
we at the World Bank Group, and with many, many other actors and agencies, are trying to address some pretty fundamental issues that countries face. Take the issue that we just went through a few years ago, a global health pandemic, which no one in the whole world was prepared for. And what we saw was that we needed to really work together as an international community, and we needed to work fast. And I think issues like that, in addition to issues of fragility and conflict, which really see no borders, or issues like the impacts of climate change or natural disasters, which also see no borders, require global action and global community to come together. So as long as we have these pressing challenges, and we believe those global challenges are with us, take air pollution and air quality, which I know is a big issue in this region, we do believe that we will continue to see a pull towards working together across boundaries, across borders, and in a multinational, multilateral setting.
Well, speaking of cohesive action and convergence, you know, I'll ask you this in the context of a conversation that I just had with the chairman of the board of the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, and their fund is coming up for replenishment and they need $9 billion at this point in time. Do you believe that sourcing capital to address some of these challenges that you spoke of, climate change, health, in the current context is going to get even more challenging now with priorities shifting and changing?
Yes, I think we have to be realistic and understand and recognize that there are many challenges posing fundraising in today's world. First and foremost, many countries are still doing adjustments fiscally and are having to revisit and review their budget priorities. So that's where we are. A second issue is that the world, as you also mentioned, the uncertainty and the risk that the world is presented with right now is also causing many parts of the world, including for us, of course, donors that have traditionally been very, very interested in seeking to support development, to also look at what are some of the near-term pressing priorities. So yes, I do think we have to recognize that raising funds is difficult. It also means, however, that we need to think very creatively, and we need to make sure that we can make the most out of every dollar, every resource that we get. And I think the World Bank is here quite interesting in that we do a lot of leveraging. So for every dollar that comes into us, we make sure that we leverage that to be multiple dollars going out, because we have found a way to use our balance sheet and use our market mechanisms to be able to generate more resources than we actually achieve. And I think leverage is the name of the game when you have scarce resources.
Well, I'll talk to you about the bigger, better ambition as far as the bank is concerned in just a second. But let's address some of the challenges that I know that you, look at very, very closely, which of course includes poverty alleviation, climate change, also debt. Given the global uncertainties as well as the global reset underway, how concerned would you be about global debt today?
Yeah, no, I think the heightened indebtedness is of a very big concern. It's particularly of a big concern in countries with limited resources to be able to essentially service that debt. And we see this problem particularly manifesting itself in Africa. Why in Africa? Because of many reasons, but in part during COVID, many African countries had to borrow to be able to provide the type of buffer and financing that was needed to be able to protect their population. And then, of course, we had multiple crises, which also included an increase in interest rates, which made the repayment of that debt much more expensive. In addition, a lot of countries in Africa had a higher level of debt to GDP, which increased their level of debt risk, which meant it also became more expensive to be able to refinance or restructure or borrow more. So you get a bit of a vicious circle. Then on top of that, you see that many of these countries have a lot of expenditures related to their own crisis, food insecurity, natural disasters. We have countries in many parts of the world where 1 week they're dealing with a flood, next 2 weeks they're dealing with a drought. So being able to anticipate and meet the needs of these crisis is very difficult. So yes, we are very worried about the level of indebtedness, and we work very, very carefully and closely with countries around the world to make sure, A, that there is a good sense of the level of debt, there is transparency and reporting on debt, and also that we as the World Bank are able to, using IDA, our International Development Association, which is our fund for the poorest, for countries that are really quite vulnerable on the level of indebtedness and are low income, benefit from very, very concessional, even grant financing from us.
You know, since we're talking about debt, and you also spoke about interest rates and the interest rate trajectory, inflation, and the outlook the World Bank has at this point in time is that most countries at this point are closer to their comfort levels as far as inflation is concerned, or at least their inflation targets. Does it worry you that the escalation of this trade war could potentially upset that?
I think, we've been living with this volatility. We've been living with higher inflation rates. We started seeing inflation go down, which of course is very comforting. I think it's very important that we try to continue to see that pathway. I think anytime inflation goes up, it hurts the poorest the most, and that's what really worries us. So that's why yes, getting to a lower inflationary environment and being able to stay there is critical for really poverty reduction and for making sure that those who are trying to get out of poverty don't fall back into poverty.
You know, you're here in India, Anna, so let's talk a little bit about the view on India as well as the outlook. You know, higher than what the government is estimating at 6.7%. The government's own target is 6.5%. But when we look at this aspiration of a Viksit Bharat by 2047, a high-income economy by 2047, and the World Bank has just put out a prospects report providing various scenarios in order for India to be able to make that journey. Given where we are today with the global environment, what do you believe India needs to prioritize? Because we're talking about an almost 8% growth rate annually for the next 2 decades.
Yeah. So I must start by really emphasizing that India is first of all an incredibly dynamic and fascinating country, and I really enjoy visiting. I always learn so much. Secondly, I don't know many other countries that have had the growth track record that India has had. Between 2000 and 2019, India grew at 6.6% on average year on year. This is incredible, and I think it really changed the dynamic in the country. Of course, COVID comes and every country gets hit in 2020, but then the rebounds was very strong in India. In the last 3 years, India has grown 7.8%. So this is, of course, very, very good. Now, you are right. We do estimate that in order to meet its ambitious goal, 2047, India does need to continue, but even elevate a little bit its growth rate. We do think it's possible, and we do think there are certain measures and levers that India can put to work to be able to accelerate towards that. One is we think India needs to continue to prioritize investment. And here we did some analysis in our report that shows that if India increases its investment to GDP from about 33% to 40% over the next 10 years, that would be very conducive towards that higher growth rate. A second issue we've looked at is actually labor force participation. It's a bit lower in India in general than other countries. It's particularly, I think, low in female labor force participation, which we believe India has a huge chance to pivot. So if we estimate also if India increases from 35.6% female labor force participation to 50%, which of course is a nice parity number, GDP could go up by 1%. 1% in the case of India is of course very significant because 1% of GDP translates to a lot of resources. And thirdly, we think there's an opportunity to get more out of increased productivity. And here we've identified 2 pathways. One is a quicker adaptation to technology and a quicker transition to innovation. So we do think it's possible. We do think it's good to set this ambition because when you have an ambition, you're working towards it. And we do like also that there is a sort of intermediate step of 2030 where India will also take stock of its trajectory towards its goal.
You know, you talked about productivity gains and how India must focus on that. I'll ask you this not just in the context of India, but global as well. With the move towards more AI adoption, what are we talking about in terms of productivity gains and the economic uplift that we can expect?
Yes. So I do think definitely technology and AI will bring productivity gains. We're already actually seeing it. Do I think it will completely eliminate the needs for a massive amount of jobs? Definitely it will affect certain jobs. But I also think it will create other jobs. And I do think there are 2 things that AI cannot do. One is the human judgment that often still has to come in. And the second thing is actually the care industry, where humans are still very hard to replace. And I actually think the care industry and healthcare more broadly is an area where the world is actually missing a lot of skills as well as human resources. And I think this is actually also an area where India could excel.
That's right. The Prime Minister is in fact talking about a Heal in India mission.
That's right.
So this is certainly an area of priority.
That's right.
But, you know, Anna, you talked about gender parity and the need to move towards gender parity. And this is not India-specific. Again, this is a global issue. It's a universal challenge. I know that this is something that's very close to your heart. Do you worry today that we're, in fact, retreating from taking this issue forward? There's been a pullback as opposed to a pushing forward, so to speak, on the issue of gender parity, gender equality, and gender opportunities.
Yes. So I think, the last few years have presented us with so many challenges and crises. I think during COVID, we definitely saw, as we were coming out of COVID and starting the recovery, there was definitely a harder hit on females, and especially females going back to work. Females were also women, were also often working in industries that were hit very hard, like hospitality, yes, and so forth, and services. So I think it was harder for women to come back. Secondly, people made so many adjustments to their lives. They consolidated their families in different ways. Their elderly moved in with them. Children were homeschooled. So I also think that kept women back in terms of their recovery vis-a-vis men. Now, I still continue to worry about a number of obstacles that prevent women from having the same access and opportunity as men. Some of those relate to things like access to services that are conducive for women to be in the workplace. And that really ranges from things like childcare to elderly care. And different societies, different cultures rely on different services here. And I think we need to really focus much more on that. Another area that I worry about is that women find, and I see this often, one of the key obstacles is that they don't feel their safe transportation. Yeah. So they would prefer not to be in the workplace where it requires mobility. A third area that I think is also very concerning, and we actually have set a target for ourselves on this, is that women are behind men when it comes to the digital connectivity. So we have set a target to actually be able to connect an additional 300 million women to broadband infrastructure by 2030, because we think that's also a game changer for many women, in particular also in the entrepreneur space. And finally, the one that always comes up over and over again is access to finance, but in particular, access to capital. So we would also like to ensure that we can contribute to this by ensuring that another 80 million women have access to capital by 2030. And this is where the work we do through our private sector arm will play actually a very significant role.
You know, speaking of the private sector, and you spoke about how the private sector can do its part in being able to achieve some of the targets that you highlighted there on the gender front, but largely the role of the private sector, part of the World Bank's ambition to leverage its balance sheet and involve the private sector as well. Where do things currently stand on that? How confident do you feel about the private sector's role and participation in addressing some of these pressing needs?
Yes. So definitely no one institution or any sort of source of funding can alone solve the problems that the world meets. So we need to work together, both the public and the private, but also partnerships. So we have emphasized now a lot working with our partners. So we have memorandums of understanding with practically every other development institution. We're innovating most recently with the Asian Development Bank to have something we call full mutual reliance framework, which is that if we work together on a project, we use one institution's policies and procedures so we don't burden our clients with multiple policies and procedures. But coming back on the private sector, we put together a very helpful group of private sector CEOs that helped identify and work with us to see what do we need to create in the markets we work in to be able to attract more private sector. And there were a couple of things that stand out. First and foremost, countries need to do their part, governments, to ensure that the policy and regulatory environment is stable. There's nothing worse for a private sector investor than when you don't know the environment you're operating in, or the one you go into changes frequently. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there are still, even with that, a need to make sure that there is de-risking and guarantees. So one thing we have done very recently is created a unified platform for guarantees, and it's already starting to become such a bigger part of our service offering and of our business. And the third part is thinking about what's needed in the local market. And one key issue that's come up here is actually local currency financing. So we're offering quite a bit of that now, which is also what the private sector is asking for. But then it's also about thinking big and bold. And one initiative that I am really, really excited about is what we call Mission 300, which is we want to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity by 2030, because 300 million would actually be half of the 600 million not connected today.
Yeah.
We think that will make such a material change to the outlook for Africa and for the opportunities for Africans. And here we see a major role for and by the private sector. So we're working very closely with the private sector to mobilize support for this and to make sure that we provide the enabling environment by working with governments so that they can take a big part of this.
You know, speaking about cooperation as well as perhaps looking at templates that could be relevant globally, as you look at India, you know, the role, significance and relevance of India from the World Bank's perspective in being able to nurture some of these solutions that you were just talking about. I mean, where do you see India fitting in all of this?
In so many places. And I think what's so exciting about our partnership with India is that India clearly appreciates from the World Bank Group our knowledge and our financing and the solutions that the private sector parts of the World Bank can bring. But what really excites me is actually the knowledge India has that we can help India bring to other countries. And India has done so much. I mean, let me just start with female labor force participation. Even though there's room to improve, what India has done to be able to ensure safe infrastructure in the form of housing to women, safe transport in the context of proximity of transport solutions close to that housing, as well as safety in housing by having things like biometric pass into the housing where women live, who have come often from rural areas to urban areas to seek jobs or to seek skills through education and training. And I think this is just great. The same with access to finance. So I think India can really share its experiences on an inclusive development process for women that is also tailored to the industries and the different pathways of careers that women are looking for. Second area, I think, is, of course, India has, in the last few years, really increased renewable energy capacity in India. And by doing so, really increased its capacity to actually produce what the world is looking for, which is technology in solar and wind, for example. So I would love to see India participate in these big initiatives like what we're trying to do in Africa and be a real player and partner in some of these projects and programs that we're looking to attract financing for, but also the equipment for. And thirdly, I think there are so many interesting things in the context of urban development that India is thinking through, particularly this concept of livability. And I know that there's a big focus on quality of life in India because India is a huge country, large population growth with urban settings and urban areas that have really been under pressure because of growth. How do you make sure these cities grow in a way that also provides high quality of life? That means air quality, access to clean water, sewage treatment and sewage disposal methodologies, and something that I know is a big priority now, which is cleaning up rivers in India. And I really commend India for taking on this very, very strong nexus of environmental management, infrastructure development, and health and quality of life.
Well, you know, Anna, I said I would get to the bigger, better ambition of the World Bank. I understand that it's work in progress, but how much bigger and how much better has the World Bank gotten since Ajay Banga articulated that move?
Yes, so it's been an incredible, pretty much just over a year and a half since Ajay joined us. I think one of the first things he did was reformulate our vision and mission, which is to end poverty on a livable planet. And that livable planet is really important because that gets to some of these issues of what does it take for a human being to really prosper in life. That's the first thing. The second thing is he brings in so many skills from his previous roles that has made us think really smart about our own ability in terms of our financial instruments. So we have been able to also do a lot of optimization on our balance sheet to be able to offer innovative products like hybrid capital, like guarantees, which again are all about leveraging because again, for every dollar that comes in, it becomes $6 to $8. So it's just really smart. He's also challenged us, and I think this is an area where he's also asked me to really lead this, to just become faster. Because if we don't deliver development solutions faster, we won't keep up with the needs of people around the world who are in developing countries. So we've really tried to cut down on the time it takes us to prepare projects. We're making good progress. We need to also reduce the time it takes to implement the project so those full benefits are delivered sooner. But we've also done things like streamline all of our processes and procedures. And even though we're a big public institution, you don't have to have the mindset of that. And I think he's really brought that in. He's also challenged us to think big through these initiatives, like the Mission 300. He said, helped us set a target on improving health services to 1.5 billion people by 2030. He's helped us think through some of these women's economic empowerment aspirations that we have. And we're thinking really now, how do we work in all these important sectors, such as water? We want to be able to do more, be a really solutions bank when it comes to energy of the future. So he's done a lot. And perhaps most importantly, taking all the different parts of our institution and making more out of it, which means what we call the One World Bank Group, which is offering the public and the private, and making sure that our clients get the best of us, not by talking to a person from one part, but making sure we always offer the whole breadth of instruments that we have to offer. So we have introduced something we call World Bank Group Managers now, who represent the whole group in a number of countries, and we're just going to keep rolling this out.
Well, Anna, I would have loved to continue the conversation, but unfortunately we're out of time. But I do want to end by asking you about your personal India connection. I believe you're quite the yogi yourself.
So, coming to India is just so wonderful. But I have to say the yogi in me just feels so at home here, because it's a bustling, dynamic and energetic place, and at the same time it has this calming zen, stable feel to it. So I always love coming back. I was here last year, and I will come back again.
Well, we look forward to having you back in India, and we thank you very much for your time and look forward to more conversation with you on where the bank sees the world as well as sees India. Thanks very much, Anna, for joining us here on the Global Dialogue.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Well, with that, it is time for us to wrap up this edition of the Global Dialogue. We are going to take a break here on CNBC TV 18. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment with more.